Jesus is King. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mass Confusion. I'm Timothy Flanders from 1peter5.com/crusade. Today's topic, how did Latin and Gregorian chant disappear? Very important topic and certainly one of the most conspicuous regarding the new Mass and what is going on. So, let's get into our topic. First, as we always do, a concession. It is true that Vatican II called for Latin and Gregorian chant to be retained in the new Mass. It's true. But it is not true to say that the new Mass without Latin and chant is unfaithful to Vatican II. Now, here I want to reference the prior video we did a couple of weeks ago about the relationship of Vatican II to the new Mass, because that goes into a lot more detail, and this show is premised on a lot of the detail in that. And just a reminder, we will take questions at the end, so save your questions, and we'll get back to those. So why is there this division? The reality is that all of these different factors are at play in the liturgical reform. And these are the things that we talked about in detail in that show, but we'll just review them real quick here. Number one, Vatican II called for reform of the Mass. However, number two, the fathers of Vatican II disagree with each other as to how that would look. We saw that at the 1967 Synod. This was documented in episode 2 of Mass of the Ages. Number three, Concilium had another idea about the reform of the Mass. And we're going to quote from Bugnini in just a minute. Number four, Paul VI at first supported the Concilium. And then number five, later, Paul VI stopped their work and sacked Bugnini. And number six, every pope since then has had a different idea of Vatican II's intention regarding the Mass. And so there has not been a unity regarding Latin and Gregorian chant. There has not been a unity among the different popes and thus among the different bishops. Now, to make matters worse, our enemies do have a unity. They do have a unity, and it's called iconoclasm, but we'll get back to that in a minute. First of all, what is iconoclasm? Maybe you've never heard of this term before. Well, it refers to an ancient heresy back in the 700s and 800s. This was a massive movement. It dragged on for about 100 years. It produced many martyrs. This was in the Roman Empire in the East, the so-called Byzantine Empire, and there was an ecumenical council against it in the year 787, which produced this anathema: whoever despises any written or unwritten church tradition, let him be anathema, end quote. Well, what was iconoclasm? Iconoclasm was a movement to destroy sacred art. Specifically, it was destroying the sacred art of the Eastern Roman Empire in the form of icons. So all the different sacred art, it was a movement to destroy sacred art. And so it was destroying these church traditions, these monuments, these paintings, these icons. It was destroying these things. And therefore, this anathema defends written and unwritten church tradition. When it says this anathema, it's defending sacred art itself. So it's specifically talking about icons, and by extension, we would add statuary to that. But it's really, this anathema is defending all of sacred art. And this is where our topic would come in to with Gregorian chant, because Gregorian chant is obviously sacred music, which is a form of sacred art. And in fact, Vatican II says it's really the greatest form of sacred art. Now, there was a second movement of iconoclasm during the Protestant Revolt. The Protestants also had their own ideas about iconoclasm, which were similar to the first movement, but they also destroyed sacred art. And they destroyed not only the statuary, not only the icons and the architecture, but they also destroyed the music. Thankfully, some of the Protestants, side note, some of the Protestants didn't do that, like Bach, for example, but that's another story. Now, in our day, it's very important that we see the 20th century liturgical reform crisis as a new movement of iconoclasm. This is very important because it is functioning on the same principles as the first two movements, and it's producing a similar amount of destruction to sacred art and music. And this is the key to understanding what happened here. This is what I put in my book, City of God versus City of Man. We're living in the period of the new iconoclasm. And I think unless we start saying what it really is, it's hard to really get at the root of the problem. Now, to his credit, Pope St. John XXIII warned bishops against the new iconoclasm, because this was not just against sacred art, but again, it was against every written and unwritten church tradition. He warned the bishops against the iconoclasm, against Latin itself. It's very important that we realize that Latin is the Roman language. This is the language of the city of Rome. And so, obviously, the question is, how can we have the Roman Rite without the Roman language? And that's precisely the question. But here's Pope St. John XXIII. He warned the bishops to, quote, be on their guard lest anyone under their jurisdiction, eager for revolutionary changes, writes against the use of Latin in the teaching of the higher sacred studies, or in the liturgy, or through prejudice, makes light of the Holy See's will in this regard, or interprets it falsely. End quote. That's from Veterum Sapientia, February 1962. That is after the Second Vatican Council had been announced, but it was the February before it began in October of 1962. So this is the winter before the fall when the actual council began. So he's warning the bishops that there's already this revolutionary change. And that term in the modern period is referring to the French Revolution, which was also certainly a very iconoclastic revolution. But really all of liberalism, those iconoclasms are really sort of more on the political spectrum in terms of destroying things, iconoclasm, even though they also go into the liturgy, obviously. But this iconoclasm was already seen. This eagerness for revolutionary changes was already seen by John XXIII. Now, side note, an important text I want to recommend here, because among many, there is a mistaken view about John XXIII. I want to recommend Henry Sear. Henry Sear is also the author of The Dictator Pope, but he wrote this text. This is one of my favorite texts about our period, Phoenix from the Ashes, the making, unmaking, and restoring of Catholic tradition. In this text, he discusses John XXIII and how John XXIII was actually far more orthodox and traditional than there's sort of this mythos that developed out of his papacy, saying that he was this sort of liberal, and sometimes Trads will even say he was a Mason. That is really not accurate. Go to Sear for more on that. But he warns them about this iconoclasm against the Latin language itself. So let's continue. Now, here's Bugnini's intentions. Now, this is important because we're going to start reading some quotes here from Vatican II. This is quoted in episode 2 of Mass of the Ages. And this is from one of Bugnini's drafting sessions, because Bugnini was in charge of writing the draft for the Constitution of the Liturgy. And this is what he said, quote, the draft on the liturgy should be, the quote begins now. The draft on the liturgy should be, quote, formulated in such a way that much is said without seeming to say anything. Let many things be said in embryo, in nuce, and in this way let the door remain open to legitimate and possible post-conciliar deductions and applications We must proceed discreetly, end quote. So based on what the text of Vatican II says and what Bugnini seemed to intend and what he did afterwards, it does appear that Bugnini, as we know from Louis Bouillet's memoir, we know that Bugnini was deceiving the Pope and deceiving other people. It does seem very plausible and quite reasonable to say that it does appear that Bugnini was deceiving everyone and attempting to deceive the bishops themselves at Vatican II with the way that he structured this document. And I think when we look at the actual document, we can see how this is. Because notice what it says here in Sacrosanctum Concilium. Quote, particular law reigning in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites. End quote. So there we have something to make all of the traditionalists happy. All the concern of John XXIII is he's happy. But it goes on. Quote, but since the use of the mother tongue, whether in the Mass or the administration of the sacraments or other parts of the liturgy, frequently may be of great advantage to the people, the limits of its employment may be extended, end quote. So, yes, we're going to retain Latin, but we're also going to extend the limits of the vernacular. Now, that seems to be a very conservative way of talking as well, however. But let's look at Gregorian chant now. Now, again, this is Roman chant. This is the chant from the city of Rome. There's other forms of Latin chant, like Ambrosian chant, Mozarabic chant. But Gregorian chant is the chant which is passed down through the city of Rome. Now, look at what Vatican II says about this. Now, remember what we said about iconoclasm. Here's what Sacrosanctum Concilium says about Roman chant. Quote, the musical tradition of the universal church is a treasure of inestimable value, greater even than that of any other art. The main reason for this preeminence is that as sacred song united to the words, it forms a necessary or integral part of the solemn liturgy, end quote. Dietrich von Hildebrand, in his Aesthetics, says that music is the most spiritual of all the arts. Whether we're talking about painting, architecture, literature, but music is the most spiritual of all those. And Vatican II says it's greater value than any other art. So we recall that anathema from Nicaea too. Whoever despises written or unwritten tradition of the church, let him be anathema. But what does Vatican II say? Quote, the church acknowledges Gregorian chant is specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. End quote. So once again, we have a very conservative statement about retaining Gregorian chant. But here comes the exception. Quote, but other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations, so long as they accord with the spirit of liturgical action as laid down in Article 30. End quote. Now, what does Article 30 say? Okay, let's go over to Article 30. Quote, to promote active participation, the people should be encouraged to take part by means of acclamations, responses, psalmodies, antiphons, and songs, as well as by actions, gestures, and bodily attitudes, and at the proper times, all should observe a reverent silence. End quote. So now we have a door opened to the new iconoclasm here. Because first of all, the new notice what's absent here. There's no mention of the new iconoclasm like there was in John XXIII. John XXIII said, there are those who are eager for revolutionary change. Therefore, we must guard against them. Vatican II does not say anything like that. It doesn't say anything about the fact that there's these eager revolutionaries. So how are we going to how are we going to deal with these eager iconoclast revolutionaries if we don't have any mention of them? Let's continue. Quoting from Sacrosanctum Concilium again, within the limits set by the typical editions of the liturgical books, It shall be for the competent territorial ecclesiastical authority, that's the bishop, to specify adaptations, especially in the case of liturgical language, sacred music, and the arts, but according to the fundamental norms laid down in this Constitution. In some places and circumstances, however, an even more radical adaptation of the liturgy is needed, and this entails greater difficulties, end quote. So we can see here, if we go over to Sacrosanctum Concilium number 30, and then we tie that in with 39 and 40, the statements here, we can see that we've got this, Bugnini here has the ammo to shoot down all of sacred art right here. He has the ammo to give all the fuel to the new iconoclastic revolutionary change. Where we're gonna tear down Latin, we're gonna tear down Gregorian chant, we're going to destroy the statue that your immigrant grandmother paid for. We're going to do all that stuff. And we're going to quote Vatican II about even more radical changes. Now, Paul VI. Here's another book recommendation we have to make here. And that is Yves Chiron, The Divided Pope. So Yves Chiron was the one who he wrote the I don't have that with me. Where's Bugnini? Oh, here it is. So Yves Chiron wrote this, Annibale Bugnini, Reformer of the Liturgy, and then he also wrote a biography of Paul VI. And he calls him the Divided Pope. And we're about to see why that is unfortunately a fitting title for Paul VI. Here's what Paul VI said in 1966. This is from Sacrificium Laudis, which he addressed to the heads of the religious congregations. Now here we have Paul VI recognizing that there's a new iconoclasm. Here's what he says. Quote, discordant practices have been introduced. Some wish to exchange the chant, which is called Gregorian, for newly minted melodies. Indeed, some even insist that the Latin should be wholly suppressed. We must acknowledge that we have been somewhat disturbed and saddened by these requests. One must well wonder what the origin is of this new way of thinking and this sudden dislike for the past. One may well wonder why these things have been fostered. End quote. Well, unfortunately, Paul VI, so we see Paul VI echoing the same concern of John XXIII. He's saying the same concern about the new iconoclasm, but I think that John XXIII was a little bit more astute to see what was going on, whereas Paul VI does not seem to see why there is this revolutionary change. John XXIII already saw it in 1962. 1966, Paul VI is wondering why it's happening. But at least he's sad that it is. Let's continue. In celebrating the divine office in choir, clerics are bound to preserve the Latin language. So he's quoting the law that monks and nuns should be chanting in Latin. In the second instruction, he notes, published in 1965, that law was reinforced. These laws are enforced and require the obedience, end quote. So Paul VI is calling all the religious congregations to preserve Latin and Gregorian chant and to obey him. Do it, he says. He continues, quote, what is in question here is not only the retention within the choral office of the Latin language, an abundant wellspring of Christian civilization and a very rich treasure trove of devotion. It is thus most surprising that under the influence of a sudden agitation, some now think that it should be given up. Again, Paul VI is surprised by this. That shows, I think, perhaps a little naivete, perhaps. But he is seeing that there is a problem here. He's not happy with this agitation. Continuing, quote, on the other hand, that choir from which is removed this language, Latin, of wondrous spiritual power transcending the boundaries of the nations, and from which is removed this melody proceeding from the inmost sanctuary of the soul, where faith dwells and charity burns, we speak of Gregorian chant. Such a choir will be like a snuffed candle, which gives light no more attracts the eyes and minds of men, end quote. So Paul VI is praising Latin Gregorian chant. He says to all the monks and nuns, obey me, I'm the Pope, obey the law, keep Latin and Gregorian chant. Here's 1967. So a year later, Musicam Sacram is an instruction for parishes, which does envision a new vernacular music for parishes and growing organically from the Latin Gregorian chant. So we still have Latin and Gregorian chant being retained, but there is an allowance for vernacular, but the instruction is a little bit less strong as Paul VI did to the monks and nuns. It seems that Paul VI is envisioning a lot more vernacular going on in the parishes, but the Latin Gregorian chant will be retained by law in all the religious congregations. However, then we go to 1969. Paul VI, the divided Pope, in 1969. Now we have this general audience. This is November 26, 1969. This is right when the final version of the Novus Ordo is introduced. Now, recall that the new iconoclasm had already been going on for 5, 6, 7, 8 years in everybody's parish. So for let's say you're 20 years old in 1960, and now you're 29. So for 7, 8 years, your parish liturgy has been destroyed by a bunch of iconoclasts who destroy your statues, rip out your altar rails. They impose their folk music. They bring in the guitars, etc., etc. This is already going on. But right at 1969, right at this moment, this is when the final version of the Novus Ordo is promulgated. And here's what Paul VI says, which seems to reverse his attitude before. And also gives all of the fuel to the new iconoclasts. Look at what he says here. Quote, no longer Latin, but the spoken language will be the principal language of the Mass. The introduction of the vernacular will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. We are parting with the speech of the Christian centuries. We are becoming like profane intruders in the literary preserve of sacred utterance. We will lose a great part of that stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing, the Gregorian chant. End quote. So Paul VI is saying, we're losing Latin and we're losing Gregorian chant. Now he goes on to say why he wants to lose that, because he wants people to understand it. He thinks modern man will be into that. Okay. But as you can see here, Paul VI is giving the fuel to the new iconoclasts. He's interpreting Vatican II in a particular way. He's taking those things that we said from Vatican II and he's tipping the balance towards all vernacular and no Gregorian chant. And Paul VI is the promulgator of Vatican II. Let's continue on. Paul VI, the divided Pope, in 1974. Voluntati Obsequens was a letter that he sent to all the bishops of the Latin Rite, which provided a minimum repertoire of Gregorian chant to parishes in the form of Missa Jubilate Deo. So the Missa Jubilate Deo is a mass setting which has the most common and easily sung and chanted Gregorian Mass setting. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the Gloria is the Angelus, Missa de Angelis, but then they took the Kyrie from a different Mass that's very easy to chant. And so it's just the most easy way to chant that everybody can chant. So clearly, Paul VI is intending here that everybody should have this minimum Gregorian chant repertoire. And then he sacks Bugnini. This is one of the divisions where he divided against himself later, where he sacked Bugnini. So, and by the time Paul VI dies in 1978, the new iconoclasm had destroyed the liturgy everywhere. Not everywhere, but many places in Western Europe and America. So we have this revolution that was happening during all this time where these documents were coming out and the documents themselves were divided against each other, as we have shown. Now, thus, the horrors of the new iconoclasm. Now, the faithful, the pious faithful, had very little recourse to defend their liturgy, defend the reverence due to the Blessed Sacrament, and defend their children. Defend their children from these wicked iconoclasts who are coming around and destroying things and thus destroying the faith of the little children. This is the main thing. There's so many stories of Catholics who left the church at this time, and it's the scandal of the little ones. It's little children who or young Catholics who were scandalized because we had these wolves come into your parish and destroy your liturgy. Destroy Latin, destroy Gregorian chant. And these were the wolves. And this is why many people in these days flock to the Latin Mass, whether that was with the SSPX or one of the few una voce sites under the indult masses in England in the 70s. We have this utter destruction going on. These are the horrors of the new iconoclasm. Now, unfortunately, the Society of Saint Pius X did not get reconciled with the church in 1988. We wish that would have been totally regularized, but it was not. Instead, the SSPX split, as we know, into the FSSP in 1988 and then the SSPX. And Cardinal Ratzinger commented 10 years later. So here we are, now we're in 1998. So we're 30 plus years of new iconoclasm. So we've got an entire generation of the new iconoclasm which has destroyed so much of our sacred art for our own children, destroyed their faith because of the sacred art. One thing I do with my own children is I catechize them with art using the Liturgy of the Home calendar. But music that we're talking about in particular, music in Latin, hearing the music for these little children, going into a profane mass, profane meaning secularized mass, secularized music. This is very acute in episode 1 of Mass of the Ages when they show it's episode 2. They show all this bad music. Now, Ratzinger comes in and says this, quote, "The contradictions and oppositions originate between the new Mass and the old, neither from the spirit nor the letter of the conciliar texts. The actual constitution of the liturgy does not speak at all about celebration facing the people." We'll talk about another show. On the subject of language, it says that Latin should be retained while giving greater place to the vernacular, above all in the readings, instructions, and certain number of prayers and chants. So Ratzinger tries, and we were very happy that Ratzinger did what he did. But the long and short of it is that the shepherds fled for fear of the wolves. The flock was abandoned to the vicious wolves, and the liturgy was destroyed. Latin was thrown out. Gregorian chant was thrown out. It's easy to say this. It's easy to say this. It's easy to quote a document, but we need the bishops to take care of the flock. We need the bishops to back up their words with actions. Stop these iconoclasts from destroying the liturgy. Stop them. It's your job. I mean, we see Paul VI, I think in particular, Paul VI saw the revolution happening before his eyes, and unfortunately he did not do enough to stop it. And this is what we need, unfortunately. We need the shepherds to stop fleeing for fear of the wolves. And the lay people, we're doing as best we can. We're going to preserve the Latin Mass, or at least a reverent liturgy of some kind. We're doing our best. But it is the job of the clerics to safeguard the liturgy. So what happened is that Paul VI was divided. Sometimes he gave fuel to the new iconoclasts, as we stated in 1969, his address. Sometimes he seemed to be against them. But he did not do enough actions to stop it. Now, it's important that we also mention here, is because it's easy for us to complain about bishops and popes not doing enough of their job. But it's important that we don't get into sort of this political complaining that we do, like how we treat politicians. We complain about them. Why didn't they do more? But the main fault of this problem is the wolves themselves. The wolves, those iconoclasts, they're the problem. They're the problem. Now, we wish that our shepherds would have defended us against these wolves, but the wolves are the real problem. And you can see from some of these texts is that the shepherds are allies with us, who are faithful Catholics. We want to work with them to fight against the wolves. So we shouldn't get too caught up into a very cantankerous or acrimonious complaining against them as if they were just politicians that we vote in and out, and we wish they would have done more. Because the real question is, what are you doing to safeguard the Mass? What are you doing? We have to do each one of us has to do our part. And that's why we're doing this. This is what LatinMass.com is all about. We're trying to do our part. We're trying to do our part to preserve the tradition, preserve the sacred art of Latin and Gregorian chant, that art of inestimable value. We're trying to do our part. So I invite you to join that. Go to latinmass.com/give. That is how you enter into this movement. LatinMass.com. We want to double the Latin Masses worldwide. We're trying to introduce millions to the Latin Mass by creating these resources. And we also, episode 3 is coming out. Mass of the Ages. Director Cameron Ahern. If you go to latinmass.com/tickets, you can go to get free tickets to episode 3. If anyone's going to be in Chicago for that premiere, that's March 9, I will be there as well. So say hi. So we hope you can make it. latinmass.com/tickets. And please join the movement. Give to the movement so we can do what our part is. You can help us do our part. We can all do this together. Finally, go to 1peter5.com/crusade to join the crusade of Eucharistic reparation. This is the spiritual side as the laity. This is what we want to do deep in our souls to make reparation for the new iconoclasm and how it has attacked the glory due to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. So this is that spiritual soul of this whole movement. And so go to this website to join the Eucharistic crusade. So with that, let's get some questions. I'm going to take a look at everybody's questions here. Let's see. Let me see. Being divided means you have no spine. Sorry for being too direct. Well, as I said, it's easy for us to criticize popes and blame them, and we wish that they would have been better. It's also easy to say, hindsight 2020. But there were also other popes who were a little weak, like, for example, Pius XI. Pius XI got duped, and he condemned the Cristeros. He condemned Padre Pio. He condemned Action Française. These are big blunders by Pius XI. I mean, besides that, he didn't consecrate Russia. So now we have World War II. So big blunders by Pius XI, for sure. But yes, big blunders for Paul VI, too. It's just important that we're fair, and we don't want to judge anyone too harshly either. Because if we judge someone too harshly, then we ourselves will also be judged harshly at our own particular judgment. So we got to be careful of that. They also destroyed the altars. So evil. Yes. Kitchen Sessions says, I was serving Mass in 67 and left because of this heresy until I found the SSPX. Yes, absolutely. Clack says, SSPX is the only option in my area for TLM. God bless them. Yes, the SSPX, there's different trad opinions on the SSPX, obviously, but the SSPX masses are listed on latinmass.com as one of different Latin Mass options. Eric says, Paul VI should have done better after removing Bugnini. He should have stopped the implementation and reverted back to Latin. Yeah, Paul VI did. So he sacked Bugnini. He also instituted he began the Freemasonic investigation into the Vatican by Cardinal Chiron, which was a very important action, obviously. That's documented in episode 2. And then he also took steps to stop communion in the hand as well. So obviously, all of us, when I die, I hope that I did all I could according to my state in life. And I hope that God judges me according to mercy, because there's a lot of stuff I could have done better in my own life. Let me take a look here. Great question here from Gloria Patri. How can we double the Latin Masses if we don't have enough priests who can say the Latin Mass? Well, that's exactly what latinmass.com is trying to do, because we are producing priest training videos for diocesan clergy to take on the Latin Mass. So this is a way that we can produce something that any priest of the Roman Rite can take on. And so this is giving them the training to allow them to celebrate the Latin Mass. So the idea is to provide the resources for that very thing. So go to latinmass.com/give. So thank you very much, everyone. Hope to see you at the premiere of episode 3 in just a few weeks. God bless.
The Mass of the Ages donors are bringing traditional Catholicism to millions. Go to latinmass.com/give to join the movement.